Hi, this is Matt Hummel, assistant professor at University of Cincinnati. I wanted to thank everyone for joining us here on our presentation with CSRI called Title IX is a Problem, the Influence and Perception of Athletic Fundraisers Regarding Facility Projects by Sport Program. I want to make sure I mention my colleagues on this presentation because due to being virtual, I'm going to be the only one talking in visual during this presentation. So I want to give a quick shout out to my colleague or former colleague, Katie Brown, who's at Texas Tech University, and another former colleague of mine, Matt Bergman, who is at University of Louisville. They provided some great feedback and insight and knowledge regarding Title IX from Dr. Brown's perspective and the fundraising side for Dr. Bergman's. But I'm going to share my screen here so we can kind of go through the presentation. All right, so hopefully you can see this. Anyone that's interested in this presentation, I created it, as you can see on Prezi. So I'm more than willing to share the URL if you want to take a look at it later on. And as I put on here, you also can reach out to me at any point in the future and we can kind of walk through any questions or interests you have in the study and kind of go from there. But to kind of get us started, we are going to kind of go over here with the introduction and kind of preface our study with we see lots of struggle within Olympic sports, and I think a lot of people see football and basketball, and depending on certain sports you can see other, or certain universities you'll see other sports that are also of interest. But for Olympic sports, especially for the coaching staff and athletes, they probably feel like it's a constant struggle for them to get attention, to get resources, to feel like they can compete on the same level as the sports that are getting the greatest piece of the pie. Now, Title IX is supposed to, and I guess does in many ways, provide equal access for athletes, but it's not perfect. There's plenty of research out there about blind spots within Title IX that can cause problems. And we're going to get to one of those examples within fundraising that highlights the issue here within this concept. But there is a huge discrepancy between football and basketball and other sports, especially from a funding perspective. It's just what football is given from a funding perspective compared to women's lacrosse is going to be a massive difference. Now, on the other side, philanthropy is an all-time higher in higher ed. And I think it's at the time we did the data collection of this, it was never been higher. And we are seeing this constant increase of what's going on philanthropically within higher ed, especially within athletics. But again, there's some data out there showing that very little contributions trickle in and actually are provided to women's sports, whether they're tagged that way by the donor or the university decides that that's the best place to provide those funds. So kind of with that introduction, it leads to our purpose and a question: why aren't we seeing more fundraising end up within women's sports? Is this a donor issue? Is this a university structure issue? But our purpose is to explore the perception of Title IX by athletic department fundraisers. And specifically, we wanted to talk and investigate how fundraisers work with donors in guiding and restricting their donations towards programs or prioritized projects. And what I mean by prioritized projects, that's what the industry will call capital projects, which are the multi-million-dollar facility projects that are specifically geared towards athletics. Some examples that have happened recently is you've seen standalone dorms that are for athletes, performance centers, and then also standalone athletic facilities that are just for one sport, specifically within football. Those are often capital projects that crop up or pop up from time to time. Now, zooming back out, we're going to kind of go into the literature review. It is always challenging to hit the literature review within presentations. There's lots of citations that we included within our study, and there's only so many that we've included here. Now, distributive justice, we kind of frame this in the sense of organizations have finite resources and they have so many programs that are needed to operate. And administrators then have the task of looking at the exact dollar amount they have and who should be provided those funds to operate correctly. Usually each program is given an opportunity to present interesting projects or reasons that they want funding, or maybe an increase of funding, and administrators have to decide what exactly is provided to each program. Now, there's three principles within distributive justice. They go by need, equity, and equality. I included a little example in here to provide a breakdown of how those are different and how essentially would lead to different issues of what's going on. And then one of the examples is we're going to talk about this later, is need can be finagled in any way, shape, or form you want. And I'll talk about how coaches potentially present what other programs are doing, their competitors, and using that as a function of need. And then another one could be need within your university. So you could say, hey, we're given $500,000. This other program is given $6 million. So those can be a little bit different. Equity and quality are a little bit more cut and dry. Equity is looking at as if you bring in $12 million, you deserve $12 million. And equality is everyone gets the same cut. But need can be a little bit wishy-washy depending on your perspective. Now, kind of diving into Title IX, I don't want to read all the details on here, but Title IX prohibits discrimination based on sex. It actually wasn't initially deemed to be a function of sport, but it ended up being that complaints started getting lodged more and more frequently within sport. And Title IX, it became obvious that Title IX was going to provide guidance within sport. And that prompted guidance on complying with Title IX for sport programs. Now, resource allocation for Title IX has been studied before. This is not anything that's new for what's going on. As you can see, I'll have to give a shout out to my advisor, Mary Hums. She's definitely written in this area as well. And there's a great article. I want to give a shout out also to Lisa Rubin and Nancy Lowe's paper in 2015 that ended up being a really big piece for us. And if you can check it out, it's a really good article. But this resource allocation has been studied before, but there's been some complaints also about issues with Title IX based on distributive justice, like the distribution portion of distributive justice. And that includes need-based and equity. So need-based, I put in here, men's sport often receive bigger budgets to match competitors. And this goes to that need can be construed in a different way of, it's easy to argue need if you're a football program that's getting $5 million in funding and another program is getting $9 million in funding. You could say you only have about half or close to half of what other programs are getting. Therefore, our need is greater to compete with them. The gaps would be different when you have a smaller amount of distribution that's provided. Equity is the same thing. Women aren't provided the same coverage and marketing materials and PR benefits that many of the men's sports are. So therefore, they're at a disadvantage to potentially have a head start within an equity framework. And so that's the problem there. If we, in the future, hopefully maybe we provide greater coverage for women's sports and therefore we'd be able to address some of those. But until then, those are going to be issues from a distribution standpoint for studies looking at discrimination based on Title IX. Now, going to athletic fundraising, we are seeing costs for college athletics have continued to rise for, a long time. And you can look up a lot of the U.S. Department of Education data and see the differences there. But schools have started to turn more and more to donors to try to make up for any shortfalls that are occurring within their athletic department. And then also, more importantly, to expand resources. So when their coaches make an argument that more funding is needed, and lots of programs are making that argument, it's easy to see that you need to find a way to expand your resources. Now, some of that is you can find some revenue benefits within your sport that you can generate, but the easy way with very little cost is to get donors to give to your program. You already have someone that's hired full-time to deal with donors, but you don't have, or any money that comes in essentially is pure profit, I guess, and it's not the best word to use, but it's the best way, I guess, to think of it. So schools love to try to get more donations because if you can get another $5 million in, that's a huge windfall of that. But also there's a huge dependence on schools to use donors to greenlight capital projects. Going back like mid 20th centuries, a lot of schools did get money from their state legislators to build new facilities, but those facilities are almost always dictated towards educational endeavors. As schools have now built more and more pieces for athletics, state legislators have had less interest for a variety of reasons to fund those type of projects. Now, luckily, donors are filling this vacuum. I guess luckily for the university, they're filling this vacuum fund these projects. But these projects, again, are almost wholly dependent on donors that have interest to do those projects, which can provide a lot of leeway for donors to dictate what goes on. But one thing we've noticed is there's tons of research on fundraising, but a lot of it has to do with donor motivation. Obviously, that's a great endeavor because it's looking at how to maximize revenue to help motivate donors. But we think fundraising is a really intriguing context for us within Title IX because institutions are required usually by Title IX to examine how they use facilities to support men's and women's projects. If you have a donor that wants to give $5 million for golf, for men's golf, that would cause a problem if it's only designed for men's golf, because it would essentially and could lead to a Title IX violation. So when it comes to facilities, you have equitable resources. So schools could build a $5 million golf facility, but a lot of them look at it as if we do that, even though your interest for the donor might be men's golf, it needs to make sure that it's usable and equitable across men's and women's golf. This can cause problems for sports that don't have a traditional men-women pairing, and that would be the biggest example would be football. So football standalone facilities can get tricky for Title IX and often require the school in the long run to look down and see what they can do about addressing women's facilities. Now, there is some way to avoid Title IX scrutiny there, and that's with outside of facilities. So if you have someone that wants to give $100,000 to men's golf for a facility, and you tell them, well, we don't have the other funds to make that facility happen, or this would put us into an issue with Title IX, they could say, if you just give us to the general fund, we can use it in other ways for the program, such as travel, which wouldn't fall under as much Title IX scrutiny as the facility. And so sometimes you can see a slippery slope there with how fundraisers can navigate pushing funds to a certain direction that will help them avoid Title IX issues. But also important is with athletic departments becoming more and more dependent on their donors. And as I'm filming this, there's been this big discussion this week about the story involving University of Texas and their donors involving the song Eyes of Texas. And it's just showing that athletic departments are becoming either more pressured or more dependent on their donors, and therefore have to kind of follow at the beat of their drum a little bit. And so that's why I think it's been important to look at fundraising from a Title IX perspective. Now, zooming back out, we're going to take a quick look at methods. Now, I want to put in here the hypothesis or the hypotheses that we have. We have two main ones. I'm not going to read through those. You obviously can at your own leisure. But really, we're looking at, is there an issue with donors supporting sports outside of football and men's basketball? And then are there barriers for these donors to support programs outside of men's basketball and football that is essentially pushing or receiving increased resources outside of that? So it's really, are the donors the one deciding this, or is somehow fundraising funneling more money to go into that? Now, to use this, we use the GEOA methodology to capture interaction of fundraisers with donors and university leadership. I do want to stress data was collected only from the perspective of donors. They did talk, or not donors, with fundraisers, but they did talk a lot about their interactions with donors and with university leadership within our data collection. So just kind of keep that in mind. Now, this provides a good background here on participants. I'll try to zoom in a touch to make it a little bit easier to read. But as you can see, we had a pretty diverse group of participants. Now, I will say this diverse within NCAA Division I, but we also had one school that was Division II. We did get funding within a conference to pursue this. And so there is a large chunk of these participants are within one Division I conference, but there's also some others. Some were chosen specifically for their sport design. One, for example, is we did do a sport that, or a university that doesn't have football, that we wanted to look at essentially if they had a different perspective. We also looked at a Division II school that didn't have football, but also has some really prominent sports that are on the men's side and issues that they've had with donors. But we've also kind of sought out some others that weren't just in that one conference, also maybe that had regional affiliations in the past with that conference, or just has some different or geographical matching within that. But we did have one group or one university that dropped out later on. they decided, after doing the interview, that they decided they didn't want any of their information to be shared or disseminated within our study. So they were excluded when we moved on to that. Now, within analysis, we did develop an interview guide on the front end with researchers and practitioners. So we worked with some people that are working in the athletic fundraising and university fundraising side to develop what we thought was the best and most accurate interview guide we possibly can for that. We also worked with researchers to make sure that we built the best scale that we could within a qualitative perspective. As you can see there, we had 18 total interviews. Large amount of these were done in person. Oh, joy to be back in pre-pandemic times. And then some were completed over phone with whether we couldn't connect in person or we decided to connect later on. But we had quite a few interview time there. As you can see, 703 minutes, which equated to 237 pages. And then one thing of note is there was the 2016, 2017 change in tax plan during this interview process. So I guess, has it been that long? I'm really scared to think about. But yeah, in the middle of interviews, actually near the end of the first big push, not only was this tax plan introduced, but at that point, it started to look very likely the tax plan was going to get passed, which it did. And so some of the interviews at that time started to have conversations, also to include discussions about how that change in tax plan would occur. None of that's going to be presented in here, but it potentially changed the perspective of donors. There was an alteration on donations being associated with season ticket purchases that has still percolated today. And at the time, we kind of caught athletic fundraising in a unique time where they were thinking about how to make sure that they were still getting in revenue from donations, but also that they could comply with the tax code, or to make sure that their donors would still be interested even after they wouldn't potentially get a tax break based on their purchase. So just kind of want to make sure that we're fully providing that information for you. Now, to kind of go into results and discussion, I am going to zoom in on this. This is definitely a graph, a figure that we included, but you can see two main components here. I'm going to kind of go over the Title IX effect here. You can see on the very far left-hand side for your viewing is going to be a specific quotes with pseudonyms that we provided to our participants. And then in the middle is our first order concepts, the themes that we thought tied in within those quotes, and then second order concepts that tied first order concepts together in a main theme. So you can see our two main themes essentially were Title IX effect and distributive justice perspectives. That was ideal for us because that was essentially the two different components that we were looking at with our theoretical framework and our main context for this study. But kind of going over that, one thing we've noticed with Title IX is that a lot of fundraisers looked at it simply as meeting minimum legal requirements. And so, for example, we have this great quote over here of they viewed it as they needed to start looking at providing greater resources or a capital project for softball. And it had nothing to do, like it talked a little bit about success, but you can tell really the main locomotive for that discussion was that there was a Title IX violation potentially unless they addressed it. And so they talk about baseball getting a $26 million brand new stadium. That's incredible. That was almost 10 years ago, but softball was still lagging behind. And so they were worried about Title IX and thought that we need to be looking at addressing that from a meeting minimum legal requirements. And again, that's a great example of baseball and softball won't necessarily be able to use the same facilities. I guess you could get fancy and have a central building that's in between the baseball and softball diamonds, but I rarely see situations or facilities like that. So often it leads to they build a baseball stadium first, again, first and foremost baseball, then trying to figure out softball. And again, at the time of this data collection, it was 5 to 6 years after they built that new stadium. So there still was quite a bit of lag time there. Now, the other thing was fundraisers talked about, they felt like Title IX restricted their donations. And they have this quote here about, hey, I know someone that would give us $5 million for track and field, but if we did it, it would take us out of Title IX. We're going to kind of get to that a little bit more in the discussion, but it just brings up some issues on how sports that aren't football and basketball are viewed really just as problematic. That, hey, I'd love to be able to help here, but it would just take us out of rotation for that. But there's been some other research that I've done with former colleague of mine, Chris McLeod at Texas Tech, actually, he's now at University of Florida, where we look at donors do have an incredible amount of influence, or fundraisers have an incredible amount of influence over donors on where they put their money. And we'll kind of talk about that a little bit later. But next was distributive justice perspectives. And this kind of looked at as how did donor or fundraisers and administrators, especially like ADs, look at essentially how things were handled from dispersing funds. So one was a lot of discussion about coaches keeping close tabs on everything. Coaches keeping ideas on what their competitors were doing or what other Olympic sports within the athletic department were getting from a fundraising perspective. Another one was kind of saying that, and I thought this was the most damning quote here, forcing support for football and basketball. We have this quote here, I'll read it out of, our Olympic sports should be the biggest cheerleaders for football and basketball programs because the more successful the football program is, more revenue is realized and more revenue opportunities are for tennis and golf. And this just shows that fundraisers are viewing it as, hey, you know, if you're an Olympic sport, you really should be focusing on making sure football and basketball do the best they can, because then you get more funding. But the challenge is football and basketball funding is going up at an exponential rate at a much higher level of cost. And so that's just creating a bigger problem there. Another one is no support for non-revenue programs. It says, you know, if we went out and tried to do a rowing project, I don't know if we would have any interest in that. But we went out and got a football project, we'd have people lined up. And that's just where fundraisers are kind of putting the onus on donors. And this last one that really hit home to me of, it's kind of like, hey, you know, the bar is you need to win a national title. If you win a national title, then we'll build new facilities for you. So one program a year gets new facilities. And with the lack of balance within college athletics, that just means the same program, like the same 4 or 5 programs, are only going to get facility upgrades. And that really stinks. So kind of going into the takeaways here, these are big pieces that we said is, it stinks that coaches have to keep close tabs on other programs to justify the request. Maybe each school should really be looking at what programs maybe are the best and could break out within them. So one thing that always kills me is like football, everyone gives football all this all this funding, and they're all competing against high level funding programs. Why not decide a couple other programs, softball, track and field, cross country, whatever, could get greater funding, and you'd probably dominate because you'd be dwarfing everyone else's funding options. But obviously that kind of takes things out of coaches' hands, and you're still going to get coaches that are upset. But it's things that coaches essentially have to fend off and fight within that. And I bring up this Hunger Games effect. So not only are they keeping track of other programs, they're having to keep track of other programs within their department and deciding it turns all Olympic sports against themselves, because it's looked at as if there's $5 million, they already know if maybe 4 million is going to go to football and basketball, and therefore everyone else has to fend for that remaining 20% of funding. And then this only champions receive funding, I think that's really foolish. Like I know going into this, but leadership should maybe look at which programs they think have the chance to break out, or maybe you think you have a really good asset with coaching, or maybe there's great talent locally around there that you think you could tap into and really take off. You need to be thinking more long-term and in the future, not worrying about exactly what's happening, because what stinks is for a lot of coaches, if they win a championship, maybe they get a chance to move on to a bigger and better job, and now you're going to be building a facility after maybe one of your best assets or after all those athletes that they recruited leave. That's a problem. Now, we also know Title IX seemed to only function as a legal motivation for people. They didn't view it as anything other than we have to just comply with Title IX. We can't worry about letting these other programs flourish. We only will get funding when it's absolutely required. So some future recommendations here for us would be talking directly to donors would be a dream. Obviously, that would be pretty challenging. But for us, that would be awesome if we could tap right into the donors there and get their perspectives and give kind of essentially cut out the middleman of telling us what the fundraiser is telling us. And then also looking at what programs with the very successful women's programs, obviously UConn basketball comes to mind. A lot of Big Ten volleyball programs like University of Illinois come to mind. It'd be really interesting to kind of get their perspective of donors. If there is successful women's programs, are they more likely to donate to those programs? I mean, that seems like an unequivocal yes to me, but it'd be great to look into that, because then it shows if we can support more women's programs, you're going to get donors. Maybe you'll get more donors, but also you're going to have donors that are going to be interested in that. And then to kind of finish this up here with questions, here's all of our content. Well, not the contact information. I saved Dr. Brown and Dr. Bergman from all this, but if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me and we can talk then. And if you have any questions about the study, let me know and we can go from there.